Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. We're broadcast on Great Plains Television, channel 26.1, Sunday morning at 8:30, repeated again at 4:30. And you can also find the episodes of Wichita Liberty TV at my site on the internet. That's the Voice for Liberty at wichitaliberty.org. All the old episodes are there, and of course show notes about episodes if we mention anything that you'll find useful. And in the show notes for this episode, we're going to announce some new broadcast hours for Wichita Liberty TV. Still, it will be Sundays at 8:30 in the morning and 4:30 p.m., but there will be other broadcast opportunities and also a chance to catch up on last week's episode as well. So watch for that at the Voice for Liberty, and we'll get you informed on those new show times. I got co-host Karl Peterjohn here, and we wanted to talk today, Karl, about I think the school finance decision. But as host prerogative, I'm going to sidetrack for just a moment because we've talked a couple times about how many people are working in downtown Wichita. The Downtown Development Corporation, now they call themselves Downtown Wichita, says a number that's about 26,000, but we have found that number is grossly inflated. For example, there's one block in downtown Wichita that has over 7,000 employees, according to this series of data from the Census Bureau. Well, to put that in context, I mean, there's about 10,000 at Spirit. There's Koch Industries is 2,500 or something. So how can there be 3 times as many people working at Koch Industries in one little square block of downtown Wichita that's mostly surface parking lots?
That's rather remarkable, Bob.
It is. And you'd think that if there was such a miracle happening, that our city fathers would be all over this trying to figure out how could we duplicate this. But the answer is no. The answer is those people are employees of the Wichita School District. And because the administrative office of the school district is in that block, all some 7,000 or 6,000 employees are counted as though they work there at First and Water Street, when in fact they're spread out throughout the city.
But Bob, the big part of the story is those people are going to be leaving downtown.
Oh, they've left. Yeah.
Actually, they have already left, but it's going to show up in the data. It'll take a while for the government tracking data and the Census Department to figure out to put them in southeast Wichita, where the headquarters of USD 259, Wichita Public Schools.
218, I think.
I think it is 18 zip code. But so you're going to see a big switch in the zip code, but it's sort of like you taking $20 out of your right pocket and putting the $20 in your left pocket.
Well, anyway, the downtown...
When it comes to jobs.
Yeah, the Downtown Development Corporation, every year in their report, they use that 26,000 number prominently. This year, however, usually the report comes out around May, but this year they just released it last week, and there's no mention of how many employees work in downtown Wichita.
Well...
No mention.
It's like a lot of things in Kansas. What's not reported sometimes is more significant than what is.
Well, here's something else.
And I think that's true in the school finance decision we're going to talk about today, too.
They're touting that there are 2,138 people living in downtown Wichita. They don't say for what year, but so it's either for 2015 or 2016, one or the other. 2,138. However, the Census Bureau does they do the decennial census every 10 years, but they also produce a lot of estimates of data through almost every year. And in 2015, the Census Bureau estimated 1,438 people in downtown. The downtown Wichita people say 2,138 people. How do they come up with that number? Well, they start with some census data, but they say a certain number of rental units have opened in downtown Wichita, and they have an absorption rate that they use, and then the average size of renter-occupied units is 1.25 persons. They do that arithmetic and they come up with an estimate of 2,100, but the census has an estimate that I think would be much more reliable as only 1,400 people.
Well, it depends on what number you want to work with. If you want it to be large, we can make it larger. If you want it to be small, we can make it smaller. And if you want it to be realistic, well, good luck.
And you know what is also pointed out to me, that included in those people is several hundred people who are actual prisoners. I mean, they're people in custody of the Kansas Department of Corrections at the facility right catty corner from the Interest Bank Arena. They're on work release, so they go out during the day and stay there at night. But so there's, of those, whatever number there are, there's quite a few that are.
We were regularly running down at the Sedgwick County Jail when I was on the county commission, approximately 1,100 prisoners per day in the main jail facility.
Yeah, and of course they aren't in downtown Wichita because the data we're using is zip code 67202.
That's right. They're across the street in 203.
They're across the street in the other zip code. But Karl, why is this all important? I mean, what does it really matter? Well, it matters because there's a lot of public policy issues going on here that we find we really can't trust our city leaders. And some of this data comes from WSU. Matter of fact, downtown Wichita people say, well, we got this from WSU. WSU, I say, what about this? And they say, well, the person who dug up this data no longer works here, but there are a lot of equivocating. It's important also because, I have a feeling before very long the city is going to ask taxpayers for several $100 million to renovate Century 2, and, they haven't decided exactly what they're going to do, but whatever they decide to do is going to be very expensive.
Well, but we're going to bond it so it won't have an impact, is what they say, which, of course, is kind of like I'm going to take out a new mortgage, and will that change my finances a bit? I think it does, but...
they say we're just going to bond
bonding and mortgaging
money.
is
they
roughly
don't
the same thing.
They say borrowing. People say bond, that sounds like kind of a benign word. But anyway, Karl, let's take our first commercial break, and when we do come back, we'll talk about the schools and what's going on there. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. Bob Weeks with co-host Karl Peterjohn. Karl, last week, as we know, the Kansas Supreme Court came out with their, what they say is the fifth school finance decision involving these parties. And I think that there were other cases with other parties beforehand. Whatever the decision is, it kind of illustrates the futility of relying upon government to provide public schooling, because if it is in fact true that the state has chronically underfunded education going back 20, 25 years or something like that, I'm saying if that is true...
I believe this I shouldn't say legislation because it is a court case, but the litigation goes back literally into the last century and arguably into the 1980s.
So if it's really true that underfunding, if the schools are in fact underfunded, and if that does in fact harm the chances of kids in Kansas to get a decent education, that's a real problem, I think, because it's been going on for decades.
Well, the key question there is getting a quality education, but the case itself, if you look at it, is even though they talk about various standards and other factors, it's mainly where is the money?
Yeah, that's what it is. They make these decisions based upon, they have these Rose standards, which were first formulated in a case in Kentucky, and they've been adopted, I think, by other states, and now they are actually statute in Kansas.
I mean, let's put it in context. The Rose standards, this is going back to the 1980s in Kentucky, which I've never heard of Kentucky as an exemplary place for public schools, private schools, or schools in general, although, I do think they have the distinction of having the first, they probably had the first elementary school west of the Allegheny Mountains. But having said that, other than that single distinction, I don't know why Kansas Constitution, the Kentucky Constitution are quite different. So I'm not sure why we would base our standards on what is a Kentucky situation and Kentucky litigation.
Well, it is a law in Kansas now. I mean, it's the legislature, it's statute number 72-whatever, but it does list there. And for example, one of the Rose standards is that students should have sufficient oral and written communication skills to enable students to function in a complex and rapidly changing civilization. Now that could mean lots of different things, and it goes on to talk about a lot of other things like that. But for some reason, the Supreme Court thinks it knows how much money it will take to accomplish those goals.
Well, actually, it doesn't, because the latest decision, unlike Montoy, where they said there's a specific dollar amount in the Constitution, which there isn't, but that's beside the point. They basically said, we think there should be more, but they didn't say more. And so it's been a sort of conundrum among elected officials, legislators, and they've asked the plaintiff attorneys, how much money do you think this is? And so we've got a very subjective opinion, and it's getting subjective comments. And so the 2018 Kansas legislature and whoever is governor at that point in time will have a very challenging task next year in terms of trying to determine what number is appropriate. And of course, the court has continued the case, so they'll be second guessing regardless of what decision the elected side of the appointed judges will be making a decision regardless of what the elected officials decide.
And you're exactly right, Karl, that the court did not say here's how much it should cost to do this, but they said what the legislature has done is not enough. So that's basically all we know.
Despite the biggest funding increase we've had in ages,
right,
and to fund it, we've had the biggest tax increase in state history.
And so the spending has gone up. The legislature has, I think the deadline, if I remember, is April 30th of next year is when briefs are due to the Supreme Court from both the state, from the state, because in all these decisions here, the state has the burden to prove that it's spending enough or meeting whatever the court said it had to do. So the plaintiffs, in other words the school districts, they just kind of have to sit back and poke holes in the state's evidence. It's up to the state to really prove that they've done the right thing.
Well, if the figures are correct that $7 million has been spent in tax funds by the school districts on this lawsuit, we maybe can see how much more money state taxpayers have to pay so they can be sued.
Yeah, so that's kind of a conundrum there of the legislature's commanded to do something but don't really know how much. Let's take our second commercial break, Karl. We'll be back with more Wichita Liberty TV in just a moment. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. Bob Weeks here with Karl Peterjohn talking about the school finance case in Kansas and kind of school spending in general. Karl, what's really frustrating is there was a story this week that Monday evening the Wichita School Board took some action. They had a contract with an internet service provider that was costing $150,000 per year. Seems fine. But they're having some trouble with their service. Not a bandwidth problem, but just some outages and things like that. So, on the consent agenda, and of course that means something happens without discussion usually, the school district decided to spend with the same company another $270,000. In other words, the contract went from $150,000 to, I can't do the arithmetic in my head, but they almost doubled.
Well, 270 is the total now?
No, that's the additional
the 270 is the additional on top of the 150. Well, that's 420,000.
So we went from $150,000 to $420,000. Suzanne Tobias, the Wichita Eagle reporter, couldn't get much out of the school district. The Wichita Eagle editorial board, matter of fact, had a slammed them and the lack of transparency from the school board.
Well, we tried to put these out for bid at the county level if we had the opportunity. The challenge we had with technology, frankly, is sometimes you get locked in, particularly with hardware, with sole source providers, and that's always a terribly difficult situation. And it's not clear from the description there what you're describing. That sounds like something that you could easily bid out and get multiple bids.
Well, there was a little bit of reporting the next day. The article's titled, "Spending Was Response to Cyber Attacks," Wichita School Board president says. So it sounded like they needed a higher level of security or something like that. And that seems really strange to me, Karl, that they wouldn't have thought of that beforehand. I mean, it's just really puzzling. But the problem is that the school district's not going to be forthcoming with this. I wrote and I asked, made a records request for the contract, the one that was signed in the spring, plus the one that they agreed to Monday night. The district has acknowledged they've received my request, but I doubt that I'll get these contracts, Karl. They're going to say that for security reasons they can't release them. Well, there's no secret about security. I mean, it just is. I think it's a really bungled thing to begin with, that the district would not have an internet service contract with sufficient protections for a school district.
Well, the school district and all other Kansas school districts or school districts in the United States and local government, they're under perpetual and continual attack.
Well, everybody is.
And it's a terrible challenge. Having said that, they have the difficulty is that there are certain things that they want people to be able to access and be able to utilize, and want people to be able to go online and get information from the school district. And there are other things. We ran into this at the county that we had to keep confidential.
Mm-hmm.
And so having a good IT operation, whether it's in-house or contracted out with, is absolutely paramount.
But all this was known by the school district in the spring. Nothing's changed since then as far as what they want to do.
I think having a definition of what services the school district needs and then getting bids from it outside is important. I thought it was interesting that one of the presidential candidates last year initially hired their IT person for a single project for $1,500. So it's a very competitive marketplace if you can come up with the right requirements.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, just for the record, this case and the presidential candidate was actually back in 2011 and didn't involve the campaign.
Mm-hmm.
But the amount of money involved, having it bid, I think, is very important. And if you aren't dotting your I's and crossing your T's, you run a risk of having some things not work out the way they should.
Well, I think the school district has really made a big misstep there, something that, they would praise the past superintendent, John Allison, up and down, give him big raises, but here can't even get a decent internet service contract, and we have to spend a lot more money for that. And it's not just that. I mean, it's that way all over. In 2015, when the state started a new assessment program for schools, the statewide test, that system was hacked, and they could not release those results. They thought that the results were so compromised in 2015 that for a whole year we didn't get any numbers about how well the students were doing. And then on top of that, in the Wichita Eagle today, we're going to have a new deputy school superintendent position. So it's a position that was eliminated some time ago, but now our new school superintendent says we need to have another one of these back, and they're going to have one.
Well, it's been a long time since we've had that position filled, and I find it ironic because we've talked about not having enough money to operate the schools, and here we are hiring staff. I've heard there's talk about having a new fee in place for the students who are doing the best and looking at AP, advanced placement programs, that they'd have to pay more to be able to take the AP tests. I think we have our priorities wrong, but we're in the middle of a school and a local election with candidates running for the school board. Hopefully this should all come out as part of the campaign. The voters can see where the candidates stand on whether their record setting and the new $1.2 billion tax hike that was approved by the Kansas legislature should go to hiring more staff for the administration building or get it into the classroom.
Exactly right. Karl, let's take our last commercial break for today. We'll be back with more Wichita Liberty TV in just a moment. Welcome back to this final segment of Wichita Liberty TV for today. I'm, of course, Bob Weeks with co-host Karl Peterjohn. A lot of this increased public school spending is going to higher salaries for teachers.
And staff in general.
Yeah, so somehow they make the case that if we pay these teachers more, they're going to be better teachers, but perhaps a little bit, they might be a little bit more motivated in their jobs and so forth, but they're always telling us that they're underfunded, they don't have enough teachers, that they don't have enough staff, that they don't have enough school supplies. Teachers all the time complain that they have to buy paper and pencils for their students to use. So we're giving staff raises rather than buying supplies. Does that seem to make any sense?
Well, it doesn't to me, but I've strongly supported the idea of having budgeting so that the taxpayers could see how much money each school is getting, and make money available for each teacher, each classroom teacher. Now, there are some teacher slots that aren't necessarily that they've got students, but they're part of the bargaining unit for union purposes.
Yeah, so we've, and by the way, of hiring that new deputy superintendent, the president of the teachers union said, "I can't believe it," and I will just leave it at that. So the union's not very happy about it. Yeah, of course we can believe that there. So lots of things going on there. So Karl, we've seen that for decades the schools have been suing the state for more money. Do you think that sets a precedent that other groups might take a look at?
I would be stunned if there aren't other groups receiving state funding out there, particularly in light of the fact that I've already heard that some groups that are normally receiving state funds are saying, hey, wait a minute, the state's got a record-setting tax increase, but our programs are not being funded. We've still got problems. In certain areas there's waiting lists. And for them to come back and look at the Kansas Constitution, find some of the subjective language that's there, and if they've got the money, I mean, the school districts have proven that you can spend millions of dollars and get billions in return. And I'd be stunned if other groups that are receiving state funds don't take that message and run.
So you're talking about, I think it's approximately $7 million that have gone to the law firm in Kansas that's been running these school lawsuits for the past decade or so, and they've gotten a lot more money from that. And people like the school districts, they think that's a wise investment of funds.
Well, I would disagree with that, the wisdom of that, because I think it's an affront to the taxpayers who are paying for both ends. They're paying for the local school districts through local option and local property taxes. They're paying the state taxes too. The bigger challenge, Bob, is that I think this is going to be very negative for Kansas' overall fiscal climate. We're going to become once again the high tax point on the prairie, which I think is a very dubious position to be in. When you look at we're one of the few states that has a statewide property tax. Our income tax rates are now close to the highest in the region, and with the current advocates in place in the legislature, I suspect we will soon exceed Nebraska, which has been slightly ahead of us. We'll soon be catching up with and moving in the direction of New York and California, which I think is very problematical. Our sales and property taxes are already high, and since we lack protections that the residents in 3 of our 4 surrounding states in Colorado, Missouri, and Oklahoma enjoy, of requiring voter approval before state and local taxes can be raised, we're putting ourselves in a very, very risky position, because states that are looking at new places to locate can easily bypass Kansas. And with the uncertainty that our courts have created, where we really can't tell you how much money it will be, but we just know it's going to be more, I think is going to be very problematical, because we've had record-setting tax increases in this state in the 1990s. We've now done it again in 2017. We've had other tax hikes in the last few years too at the state level, and the argument that the 2011 and 12 Brownback tax cuts were a failure has never taken into effect the fact that at the same time that was occurring, the federal taxes were going up in a variety of ways and areas, and mainly Obamacare related, but there were other increases. And
the headwinds we faced with aviation and agriculture and energy production all at the same time. Remember our guest last week, John Funn. What does Colorado and Oklahoma give to their citizens that we don't have in Kansas?
Well,
initiative and referendum.
Yes.
So that is where citizens in California and Oklahoma can propose their own laws or cancel laws that the legislature has taken. We can't do that in Kansas, at least at the statewide level.
Well, Missouri has it too. Colorado, Missouri, and Oklahoma all have it. And I think that's part of the reason why generally on most issues, Kansas and Nebraska have higher taxes, because the people have been disenfranchised.
There we go. So that's it again for another episode of Wichita Liberty TV. Thanks so much for watching. Remember, take a look at WichitaLiberty.org. You'll find the new broadcast times, the additional broadcast times for Wichita Liberty TV, and we hope to see you again next week.